Thought Leadership from PwC's National Office.
I would really encourage companies to, well, of course, pick up our standards and read them. That's always a good place to start.
Yes.
But also thinking a little bit strategically. I think it's easy to suddenly get overwhelmed with sort of a compliance mindset of what do I have to comply with. And I'd really encourage people to stop and think about, okay, sustainability risks and opportunities are important for me to have a well-functioning, successful business.
Hello. Today we're back talking ESG. This time with a special guest from the International Sustainability Standards Board. This is PwC's Accounting Podcast. I'm Heather Horn, and thanks so much for joining us today. It's been over a year since the ISSB launched IFRS S1 and S2 on June 26, 2023. As a belated celebration of that first birthday, today's episode focuses in on what the ISSB has in store for the next 2 years. To discuss these updates, I'm happy to welcome back to the podcast a special guest, ISSB Vice Chair Sue Lloyd. You'll get an inside look from Sue as we cover everything from the ISSB's work plan and new projects, their new strategic partnerships, the interactions of the standards with the ESRS, and the adoption of the standards around the globe. She also provides some helpful perspective about how you can think about all of these developments in the context of your own sustainability reporting. With that, here's my conversation with Sue. Sue, welcome back to the podcast. So nice to have you on today. And it's an exciting time. I ran into you a few weeks ago when you had your discussion of the ISSB standards 1 year later. And it's hard to believe it actually has been a full year since those were launched. But I guess from your perspective, maybe catch us up and give us some point of view in terms of areas of focus and what you've seen since then.
Sure. Thanks, Heather, and thank you for inviting me. It was great to bump into you at the London Stock Exchange for the first birthday party of the first two standards for the ISSB.
Yes, although I thought you should have had a cake with a candle, since you did refer
it wasn't quite the birthday.
Yes,
it was
that's
a couple
true.
Of days off.
Okay, fair.
And anybody who's lucky enough to watch my post on LinkedIn will know that we did have a cake in the office on the actual birthday of the twins in IFRS Foundation transition. But you asked me, in the last year. So firstly, people say, I can't believe it's a year. And I say, I can't believe it's a year because it feels like about 10 years because it's been so hectic since the end of June last year. But a big year for the ISSB with the prompt endorsement of our standards after their publication at the end of June last year with the IOSCO, the International Securities Regulators, encouraging their members around the world to use the standards. The TCFD deciding to sunset as a consequence of the publication of our standards, saying essentially our publication of our inaugural standards was the culmination of their work so that they could disband. So that was a big moment for us as well. And at the end of July, announcing the close alignment with the work of the European standard setter, EFRAG, on the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS. So those were all really important moments right back very quickly after the publication of the first two standards. And since then, we've really been focused on adoption of the standards around the world, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Supporting implementation of the standards has been very, very important to us and our capacity building work, and starting to look ahead to what the future work plan is going to be. So as good standard setters, we're never going to rest on what we've published. We're always on to the next thing. So re-deliberating following the agenda consultation last year when we asked our stakeholders to tell us what they wanted to work on next. So those are the sort of three areas that we're focusing on now.
All right. Well, definitely will give us a lot to talk about. It's going to be hard to keep this into 45 minutes. But maybe starting then, I think probably one of the places that's of most interest to the audience will be just the spread of the standards and adoption around the world. And that's something, you mentioned has been a focus area. So from your perspective, what are you seeing and what are some of the big, I'll use the word wins, that you would talk about? And then what do you see upcoming potentially?
Yes, so where do we start? So the highlight for me, and the thing which I think is probably most exciting and the most surprising and the positive for me, is the pace of interest in adopting our standards around the world. So it was pretty amazing how swiftly, following that endorsement by IOSCO, which we expected to be an important catalyst for the adoption of our standards because that had that effect for the International Accounting Standards Board standards 20 years ago, we have now more than 20 jurisdictions who have either made decisions to use our standards or are in the process of consulting on using our standards around the world. And at Athens, the IOSCO meeting at the end of April, we took the opportunity to do a stock take, and that stock take shows us that those 20 plus jurisdictions account for more than 55% of global GDP. So the number of jurisdictions account for more than 55% of global GDP, more than 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we're talking about a lot of coverage of the world. And if you look at the list, what's really interesting to me, if I look at that list of more than 20 jurisdictions, is just how diverse that list is. That's the first thing I would say is really interesting and exciting. All the way from ranging from very sort of mature capital markets like the UK, Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, who are very well known for the type of information they would ask for in their markets. And so you would expect them from a transparency perspective to be interested in the global comparability and high quality disclosures that we're looking at. But then also a number of emerging markets, Nigeria, Kenya, Costa Rica, looking at the adoption of our standards and understanding why they are interested. You learn quite a lot. So they're interested because of the need to attract capital for transition, the need to have confidence in markets, and also the importance for trade. If you're a key player in global supply chains, which is true of many of these emerging market economies, knowing that you're collecting the information that your customers and suppliers need for their reporting can give you a trading advantage. And we're really seeing that coming through. And so I think that the diversity and the depth is interesting. Also, we're very excited that we got to the point with Europe where we were able to publish our interoperability guidance, which shows a high degree of alignment. And the work that we've done shows how to apply our standards and European standards to get to a position where the same disclosures can be used to meet the climate disclosure requirements and both sets of requirements. There's more to do for Europe. They've got a broader focus, but a core set of disclosures that are aligned, which is really important for efficiency. And the fact that you can use our standards that are the sector-based materials in our climate standard and in the SASB standards to fill in the sector gaps in Europe. And you can use ESRS to fill in the topic gaps for ISSB. So that's really, really important as well. So to have Europe describing themselves as being the first jurisdiction to adopt the ISSB's global baseline is personally satisfying to me because I don't think anybody thought we would get to that position. So that's important. And of course, good commonality between our requirements and the SEC's climate rule as well.
So many follow-up questions for you on that. Maybe one to start with those. It's very interesting, your point on emerging markets, because probably a year or so ago, I was talking to Eelco van den Ende from GRI, and he was talking to some companies in emerging markets where it was the opposite. So in those particular emerging markets, they were seeing that maybe companies, that were procuring goods or otherwise from them were saying, well, we may not be able to continue using you as a supplier because you're unable to give the information, that we need. So this is really the inverse of that, right? Where you're seeing that actually some of these countries are proactively adopting the standards to address that exact issue.
Exactly. And it's really, I think, exciting to see people not just looking and saying, look, this looks hard, but looking and saying, actually, is there an opportunity here that we can turn this to our advantage, which is fabulous to see, and making use of the proportionality that we've included in our standards. We were really careful in our standards to make sure that we don't ask everybody to do exactly the same thing. We want you to disclose on the same matters, but the information that you need to use can be different depending on your circumstances. And I think that that's being embraced, which is great to see.
One other quick question that I hear come up relates to, as these different jurisdictions are adopting the standards, some of them are putting a local spin on them. And obviously we see with IFRS that there is with small variations, the IFRS accounting standards, I should be very specific, that with very small variations, they are consistent across the globe versus with these IFRS sustainability standards, we are starting to see some variation. And perhaps that's natural given where we are, the relative infancy of sustainability reporting. But just curious from your perspective, if that was surprising to you or what you think you will see as we continue to see this evolve.
Yes. So firstly, I don't think there is as much variation as people are talking about. So I'm pleased you asked me the question. And what we're also seeing is that there's some movement that's often back in our direction. So let me talk about those two things. So firstly, we expect variation in the sense that we always knew that there was a different complexity to sustainability reporting, which is different to accounting. With accounting, people providing information in financial statements, and they changed their accounting language from a local language to an IFRS accounting language, but it was about financial statements. Sustainability reporting is different because investors need high-quality information to inform their investment decisions, but lots of others are also interested in sustainability information. So we knew from the start that there would be a potential desire for local add-ons to disclosures. So we've always talked about this building block approach. And that's pretty clear in the ESRS interoperability guidance, if you pick that up, and I recommend people do. There's a lot of common disclosure, but there's a big chapter at the back, which is all the extra stuff that Europe has asked for. And that's fine by us as long as you can see the investor material information and it's not obscured. So that's a form of variation that we expected and we don't mind. What we are more sensitive to is variations in the set of information that we have identified as being investor material, and that's where the differences come about. And people talk about there being variation. In fact, there isn't as much variation as people would suggest. So if I look, for example, at these 24, I think it is, jurisdictions now who have proposed building on our standards, for those that have decided to propose specific climate disclosures, they've all proposed that Scope 1, 2 and 3 greenhouse gas emissions be disclosed. And I'm pausing there because I don't think people realise that. I think only the Philippines have suggested that there's not there. There's questions in the consultations for sure about whether it should be there, but the proposals are actually aligned. And so I don't think there's as much deviation as what some people might be saying. The other thing we are seeing is that in some cases where there were differences proposed, and I think Australia is the poster child for that, they got very strong feedback, including from investors, but also from the financial community, the financial regulatory community as well, that they needed to be more closely aligned with the ISSB's global baseline, and their AASB is still redeliberating, but many of their decisions so far have been to move much more closely back to the ISSB global baseline. So what we're actually seeing in some consultations is feedback from the market is reinforcing, actually, we don't want the deviation from the global baseline. So I don't think there's as much deviation as people would suggest. Now, having said all of that, one of the things that we do know may be necessary, and it's in fact contemplated in our jurisdictional adoption guide that we published at the end of April at the Athens IOSCO meeting, is what we want ultimately is as many companies as possible using the full ISSB global baseline, because that's best for companies, it's most efficient for companies to have a global language, it's best for investors, for comparability and high quality information. But we know it's a lot to go from where companies are to get to that. So the idea that jurisdictions would phase things in, start with big companies first, maybe not require the complete set of disclosures immediately, but allow a little more time, particularly on the things where we allowed more time. So we only asked for Scope 3 in the second year. If a jurisdiction wants to extend it a little more than the second year, that's okay. And our jurisdictional adoption guide talks about that, how a proportionate approach to phasing in can be appropriate in a jurisdiction, but we want people to keep the aspiration that the punchline is the full ISSB global baseline, and we'd much rather have some measured phasing in within a jurisdiction rather than permanent deletions of requirements. And we are seeing some of that, which is something that we're receptive to.
Well, and I think your point that it's better for companies and users cannot be emphasized enough, because differences create issues for everyone, because then you have to understand the differences. You have to understand what to use for the differences. So, it is encouraging to see some of the feedback you're getting, and it will be interesting to see as it continues to evolve how this works. One thing you mentioned there, well, many things I follow up, but one that I wanted to touch on is the interoperability with the ESRS, and in particular, that interoperability document. And I also encourage people to pick that up because it is extremely helpful. And in one way that I think it's helpful is a question we often get is for companies trying to adopt both sets of standards, so they want to be compliant with both, is they get into this question of obscuring information. And you mentioned that as well. And I think it can be almost a crutch or an excuse of, well, maybe this additional information will obscure and otherwise. I know that's something you've thought about and have some views on. So just curious, your perspective, if someone is thinking of having other information, so you can comply with more than one set of standards, how you would think about that.
Yeah, so the interoperability guidance is carefully worded to note a couple of things. So what people are needing to navigate here when we're looking at the ESRS requirements is that we allow the presentation of our information in different ways, as long as it's provided at the same time as the financial statements and in the set of general purpose financial reports, where location agnostic is the term that we use, so we don't dictate the particular position within the general purpose financial report. And that enables us by design to be complementary to jurisdictional requirements. And in the European requirement, you have to provide the sustainability information in a separate part of the management report, and it needs to be provided in a particular order of disclosures. Because we're not prescriptive, that gives us the opportunity to enable both sets of requirements to be met as long as the incremental information is not obscured. So you need to be careful with how you present the information is the short answer. And I think there's different approaches, and we'll see how those evolve. But things like indexing and highlighting, formatting, I think is what we're looking at in terms of providing information in a way that you can identify the subset of information which is ISSB relevant, for want of a better term, is what we're contemplating that people will do. I think it's a really beneficial exercise because it ensures that those who are providing information who have got peers who are perhaps using only ISSB information then are facilitating this comparability with investors, so it's worth the effort. It also helps tell the story because it's focusing on key drivers of value from an investor perspective, which is useful for communication. And the thing that we do note in the interoperability guidance as well is there's more to come in digital reporting, because digital reporting gives us another way to make this process work well. And so we're working with EFRAG to ensure that our taxonomies are interoperable and to see if we can find ways from a technology perspective that would enable the identification of that subset of ISSB information to enable it to be highlighted and extracted in a sense from the bigger set of information. So I think more to come.
Well, and I do think the point on digital taxonomy, we also did an episode on that. And I do think that's a critical piece that sometimes people miss. So highly encourage our listeners to check that out, but also to encourage these efforts, because I do think that is a huge way to bring different standards together. All right, let's turn our focus, because you mentioned the London Stock Exchange meeting, and on that day, you made a number of announcements in terms of additional partnerships and work that you are doing with the GHG protocol, TNFD, and I think it's helpful to talk about that, because I think we're just talking about the challenges of reporting under two frameworks, but I think some of these other reporting responsibilities and thinking about greenhouse gas emissions are some of the more challenging areas. So I think you had some helpful news from that perspective.
Yeah. So, and I'll focus on a couple of a number of the different partnerships that we have here, including the ones that we announced on that at that London Stock Exchange meeting. Because what we're really focusing on at the ISSB is we really have, I think, two important roles to play. The first central role is what we've just been talking about. It's developing this global baseline of information to meet investors' needs in capital markets, high quality, comparable information. So building that set of disclosures is really important. But we're also really aware that because we're building a global baseline, we have a sort of key opportunity and responsibility, as far as I'm concerned, to help make this ecosystem as efficient as possible. And if you compare this with financial statement world that I came from not that long ago, we're fortunate that we're building a new system. So we have an opportunity to think about the plumbing in a way which we haven't so much, and something that's evolved over a longer period of time. And so one of the things we're thinking hard about is what can we do as the ISSB in this ecosystem to make this as an efficient and effective reporting system as possible. And these partnerships are really about that. And so maybe I'll use that context to describe the partnerships. So one is the GRI relationship, which is incredibly important. And of course, the GRI MOU that we entered into in March 2022 is a while ago now, but we sort of updated it just a couple of months ago to say that we're going to sort of double down on this partnership. And what we want to do here is to make sure that companies that want to report both to investors to meet regulatory requirements and to broader stakeholders can do so in an efficient way. And we have committed with GRI to work together to achieve that by finding common disclosures that are common to our respective unchanged remits that we can identify and align so it's really clear how you fit our reporting together in an efficient way. That's really beneficial for companies and for those using the information. So that's a really important reinforcement of an existing partnership. Then we looked at other partnerships, and so there's a few. One is on the production of information, if you like, and so the GHG protocol is an important one. We're really proud to have been the only standard setter to actually require the use of the GHG protocol. Others allow it, but allow other things. We've required the use of the GHG protocol, subject only to jurisdictional requirements in some cases. And that means that we are really reinforcing the use of the GHG protocol. As a result, the IPSASB, the Public Sector Standard Setter, is proposing to build on that, as is the Basel Committee. So we're playing a very central role. Because of that, we decided it was pretty important that we make sure that the GHG protocol is fit for purpose for capital markets, because we are heavily reliant on it. And so we decided to enter into an agreement with them to make sure that we're involved in their governance, including having an observer on their independent standard setting board. So that makes sure that we are happy with proposed changes to the GHG protocol. So that's important. We also have learned increasingly over the last 6 months or so that there's increasing interest in transition plan disclosures, which are already required by S2. If you have a transition plan, you need to provide information about it. But we want to make sure that that's high quality information, and we really want to do what we can to reduce fragmentation, which we can do as a global standard setter. So to support that, we entered into an agreement with the Transition Plan Task Force to take responsibility for their disclosure materials, 13 documents that they've produced on how to provide good disclosures about transition plans. In the first instance, we'll put those on our Knowledge Hub, and then over the next months, we plan to evolve those from third-party materials on our Knowledge Hub to educational materials with our brand on them that are globally applicable and to ensure they're purely disclosure-focused. So really reinforcing the importance of transition plan disclosures and making sure we're doing what we can to reduce the risk of fragmentation. On the sort of public production of disclosures side again, we have confirmed our sort of working arrangement with the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, who've been working hard on their recommendations. And we agreed when we decided to have a project on nature, biodiversity, ecosystems and ecosystem services as part of our new work plan, that the initial research that we will do will include a focus on the TNFD recommendations. We're looking at ways to build on those recommendations and to bring them into our standards in the same way that we did with the TCFD recommendations. So that's an important partnership. And the last one, slightly different but also really important, is with our CDP. So we entered into a memorandum with them to confirm that they are our key implementation partner when it comes to climate disclosures. They're a really great catalyst for the adoption of our standards. They've aligned their revised questionnaire so that our climate requirements provide the foundation or the baseline for their questionnaire, which is a really important way of creating efficiency again. It means that if you're using our standards, great news, you're well positioned to fill out the CDP questionnaire. Or if you're filling out the CDP questionnaire, great news, you're well on the way to using the ISSB standards. So a really important strategic partnership in the ecosystem.
Yes, and I think particularly when you look at the number of companies that are already filling out that CDP questionnaire, to your point, those companies with the revised questionnaire are going to be a huge step along the way to disclosing the metrics and otherwise needed from an ISSB perspective.
It's really important, and they had a really important role with the TCFD recommendations. So we see that similar ability to act as a catalyst. And while we focus a lot on regulatory adoption of our standards, we just want use of our standards. So voluntary use is good as well. And
yes.
CDP encourages that.
Yes. So one question for you on TCFD, which I know is the partnership from last summer. I definitely got a lot of questions about what that means. And if you go look at TCFD's website, it says this is frozen. We are now, I can't remember their exact wording, but I'll use the word
sunset.
Yeah, sunset. Thank you. And so if I'm a company, for example, that's thinking about my responsibilities to report in California under California 261, that rule, which is expected to scope in 10,000 companies, specifically allows the use of the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards, which is great news, but is reliant on TCFD. So how do you think about then a company that is reporting under TCFD? Are you expecting them, at least a few years from now, there will need to be a transition, or is this still a bit unknown what that will really mean?
So the formal position is that the TCFD won't write anything new. So they've handed over, the legacy, if you like, to us because it's embedded in S1 and S2, and so they don't need to do any more because we exist now. The TCFD recommendations are a document that still exists, and it's a document that has a place in some regulatory frameworks as well. And so that doesn't go away as a result of the birth of the ISSB or the publication of IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. What I would anticipate, firstly, we purposely built on the TCFD recommendations because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, but also it's a fantastic stepping stone. The TCFD recommendations are a fabulous stepping stone to using our standards. So if you've already used the TCFD recommendations, and especially if you've used them with the SASB standards, you're really well positioned to use our standards. So it's a great step towards using the ISSB standards. I hope what will happen over time we'll see an evolution away from the TCFD recommendations to the ISSB standards, because they bring an extra layer of rigor and specificity. They're designed for enforcement. There's more words, there's more specificity, and they're not just recommendations. Recommendations are what they say on the tin. They're things you might do, but they're not what you have to do. And if you look at TCFD recommendations, applications, and practice, there's not many companies who do everything that's in the TCFD recommendations. Whereas if you come to the ISSB standards, particularly if there's regulators involved, you actually have to do everything. So it's a more complete set of disclosures, and they're more comparable because we've added more specificity. So it's an evolved version of the TCFD recommendations is how I think of our standards.
I think that's great perspective. And I do think as companies are looking at compliance obligations globally, either that stepping stone approach or saying, okay, I'm going to move towards reporting under S2 with the supporting parts of S1 so I can meet, let's say, California obligations and, some of these other obligations. It's going to move you along faster and help, again, with interoperability worldwide. So I think it's a very important perspective. You mentioned the work plan. So it's also very exciting, and I think good news for companies that are looking for more specificity in some of these areas, to the point you made about the benefits of the S2. So what can you share with us about the work plan?
So firstly, thank you to everyone who's listening who wrote to us. We had a huge number of comment letters, which is fabulous, so that we got a really great understanding of what our stakeholders think is important, and particularly from investors, a really high number of responses, which is really great because it's traditionally quite hard to get those letters. So you told us that very, very clearly that the number one priority needs to be making sure people have got what they need to apply S1 and S2, because that's already a lot moving to that reporting. And so the number one priority that we've agreed to focus our time and effort on is supporting those using our standards, and that will be the case even with our new work plan. So making sure we've got the educational materials that we need, making sure that, for example, our transition implementation group that's answering questions is, up and running and providing the support needed, and just not losing sight of that need for support. So that's a word of reassurance to listeners out there. We know it's a lot to do. But we're starting to look at new things, and we've really decided to focus on sort of two chunks of work. The first is new topics that we will look at, and the board's decided to choose two main topics to look at: nature, so biodiversity, ecosystems and ecosystem services, and the second topic is human capital, which is not just about your employees but also workers in your supply chain. And in both cases, looking at the information which is investor material. So what do you need to know to really understand how nature-related risks and opportunities, human capital-related risks and opportunities really inform your prospects that's important for investors to understand. So those will be the two topics that we'll start researching. The second strand of work that we have is enhancements to our SASB standards, which are really important and actually closely linked to supporting the implementation of S1 and S2. S1, as you know, asks for reporting beyond climate, and we refer to the SASB standards as a sort of first port of call to be looked at, to consider when you're doing that. We know that there's more that can be done to enhance those standards, so that's a priority stream of work for us alongside the new research on nature and human capital. And actually at our board meeting in Montreal in July, we'll talk about which parts of the SASB standards will enhance first, what the priorities should be. But we really want to make sure that those using S1 have got an up-to-date suite of standards which is truly internationally applicable, that really can help companies to identify what to report on, like what really matters to investors about sustainability risks beyond climate. And what are the key metrics and pieces of information to help me do that? We really think that not only are the SASB standards well designed to meet investor needs, they're well designed to be proportionate for companies to report in an efficient and effective way on sustainability risks to attract capital.
So let me ask a follow-up question starting backwards. So at the sector standards, because another question we've been getting or discussion we're hearing is, obviously we also know EFRAG is working on sector standards, and I think you have 77, they're planning to have something 40. And I think for companies thinking, okay, now all of a sudden, now this is another 120 standards or something, obviously all not applicable to all companies. But in terms of working together directionally, I think ideally, some people would like to see just one set of sector standards out there. But if that's not possible, how do you see at least there being some alignment between those?
Something I'm spending a lot of time talking about at the moment, so it's very topical. I think the first thing that we would note is that we're in a different situation to the situation we had with ESRS and the ISSB standards for the first round. We didn't have anything like the ESRS standards when they were drafting them. S1 and S2 came along, and then we were working out interoperability. In this case, the SASB standards, which we have at the Foundation, are the most comprehensive, complete set of sector-based standards for reporting on sustainability that exists anywhere in the world. So we have a head start, if you like, on this, and they've been designed specifically for investor materiality to meet investors' information needs. So we've got a great head start there. And of course, EFRAG have been asked to develop sector-based standards. We're talking to EFRAG because we're really, really keen to see if we can align the timing of our standard setting, because I think it would be great for the market if we were able to work in a more aligned timeline, so we're not back-solving for interoperability, which is what we did for the interoperability guide, which was no fun, I can tell you. But rather we're trying to really look from the start for opportunities to identify existing metrics in the SASB standards or potential enhancements to the SASB standards that could also form a basis for the investor piece of the focus of EFRAG. Now, EFRAG, of course, has impacts to think about as well because of their double materiality, but they have the investor base. So we're really keen to align as much as we can to create that interoperability. And I shouldn't leave GRI out of this because they're a really special partner for us as well. Part of the agreement that we have in this new re-articulation of our Memorandum of Understanding with GRI is to work not only on sort of topic-based standards like our biodiversity project, but also on the sector-based standard setting. So we're really looking for synergies between our work, GRI, and EFRAG's work, because the dream here, as far as I'm concerned, is that we do have good alignment so that companies aren't left with myriad different industry-based disclosures to deal with on top of the topic-based stuff they've already got to deal with. And we have a real opportunity to do that here. And actually, again, at our July board meeting, one of the considerations for us when we work out what to prioritise in terms of our SASB enhancements is considering the projects that are on the agenda of EFRAG, what their priorities are and what GRI is looking at, along with other considerations where investor needs are, and there's other factors as well. But one of the considerations is interoperability. And I think that the staff's recommendations on the priority sectors to focus on will give us good alignment, so a real opportunity. So if people listening to this believe in this, the more you tell us all that this is a good idea, the better.
All right. Well, the people I'm talking to do believe in that. So hopefully people listening will communicate that. So then let me jump actually to the first topic you talked about, which was supportive implementation, because I think that's of huge interest, both to regulators as well as companies and other stakeholders. So what particular items are you doing there that you'd want to highlight?
There's a few different things there. So firstly, we do have our transition implementation group, which is a group that we've set up that discusses publicly questions that have been submitted to us or that we've become aware of in our outreach about the application of S1 and S2. So if you have a question when you're using our standards, if you look on our website, you can submit questions if you meet the criteria, and that's there. And we produce minutes from those meetings, which are designed to help understanding of the standards. So that's one important source. We're also looking at educational materials. So we've already published the interoperability guide, which is helpful for those looking at ESRS. We published a document along with GRI on commonalities in GHG emission disclosures. We published some materials in December about how you need to think about some aspects of nature and human capital, even when you're reporting on climate using S2. If you've got water issues because of climate change, that can be really relevant to your risks as a business, even before we write a water standard. So that's important. We have a webcast on current and anticipated financial effects, which I would encourage people to look at. And we're in the process of working on some materials on materiality and looking at some more examples on the disclosures on current and anticipated financial effects. So what we're doing there is really good. We've got our ear to the ground on where people need help, and we're trying to respond to that pretty actively. So if you look on our Knowledge Hub, there's a lot of materials there, both that we've produced but also that others have produced that we've identified as being relevant. That's a good source of information. And if you look on our website under the sustainability tab, we've got a section on application support. And if you have a look there, you'll find these educational materials. And actually, I should also give a shout out to my integrated reporting team. We have some materials on how to use the IR framework and report using S1 and S2 to help people who want to use our standards and also do integrated reporting.
All right, definitely a lot to explore then for companies to think about. One of the other things you mentioned briefly at the beginning, we've talked about, but it's, I think, worth mentioning again, is capacity building. And I know that that's an important part of the work you're doing. So is there anything new to highlight there that we should at least mention?
Yes, so it continues to be a priority for us. There's just so much education to do out there, and we can't do it ourselves. So we're working with partners as well. So there are some important initiatives. We're working with the UN SSE, the Sustainability Stock Exchanges. We're doing a lot of training there. And we're also in the process of starting to work with regulators through IOSCO, in particular on training programs, the teacher-type programs, and talking to some of the multilateral development banks as well. So there's more to come on this training space. And also we have an FSA course that people can learn about our reporting as well.
Wow, it's a lot. It's almost overwhelming when you list it all in the space of 40 minutes, how much is going on. So taking a step back then from your point of view, and if you're speaking to a company that is preparing or thinking about different standards, maybe voluntary to start with, adopting them voluntarily, what pieces of advice would you give as companies are evaluating the landscape and how they should be approaching this?
So I think that I would really encourage companies to, well, of course, pick up our standards and read them. That's always a good place to start.
Yes.
But also thinking a little bit strategically. I think it's easy to suddenly get overwhelmed with sort of a compliance mindset of what do I have to comply with. And I'd really encourage people to stop and think about, okay, sustainability risks and opportunities are important for me to have a well-functioning, successful business. So how do I approach it through that filter? And if you pick up our standards and sort of think about it with that mindset, and you think about things like governance and strategy and risk management and metrics and targets, and think about how this information is actually not just relevant to report to third parties, but also for me when I'm running my business, and evolve the reporting from that. I think that's a good way to think about it. And then it certainly requires investment and so I think you need to be prepared for that, because moving this reporting, even if you were doing reporting before, to prime time, to be alongside the financial statements, prepared at the same time and subject potentially to assurance and regulation is a different mindset. So you need to get the right people in your organization involved in the conversations, not just the finance people, not just the sustainability people, but a combination of them both. So I think thinking about how to get the right people involved in the organization is a really important question. And then I think the last thing I would say is I hear a lot of confusion about, what do I look at? I've got the SEC climate rule over here, even though it's stayed, it exists. We've got ESRS here, we've got the ISSB, we've got GRI, we've got all of these jurisdictional things. I can only imagine how overwhelming it must be. The good thing about the ISSB standards is we're designed to be at the core of things. If you use the ISSB standards, and I think the interoperability guidance is probably a very good way of illustrating this, it can provide a core that's then an anchor for many different links into different reporting. And so I would really think about whether strategically you can use S1 and S2 as your anchor to then facilitate different types of reporting to broader stakeholders because of our partnership with GRI, linking into ESRS because of the interoperability, and knowing that all of these other jurisdictions are looking at things that are based on, building from the ISSB standards, so it's a good core. And so I think that's a good way of cutting through the complexity of which one do I pick up.
All right. Well, I have many more questions for you, but I think that's an excellent note to end on. So, Sue, such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
That's our show for today. Tune in next week for more fresh episodes. So that you never miss any of our audio content, follow the PwC Accounting Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And to stay up to date on all our latest accounting and reporting news, sign up for our newsletter at viewpoint.pwc.com. From Thought Leadership at PwC, I'm Heather Horn. Thanks for tuning in.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates, and they sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.